The Freedom of Information Act has made a very big difference to the state of disclosure. I mean, before FOI, a lot of public authorities basically treated what they did as an extension of the chief executive's personal affairs. I mean, you'd sometimes have a chief constable saying, no, the reasons why police officers get disciplined and what happens is simply a private matter for us. Public have got no reason to know about it, no need to know about it, and certainly no right to know about it. And ministers would take that, and local authorities would take that view. That's largely gone under FOI. FOI has created the expectation that the public does have a right to information. It's reversed the burden proof, put it on the authorities to justify withholding the information, and it's raised expectations, the public's expectations be disclosed, and most critically, it's put an enforcement mechanism into place. So what's most revealing is if you look at how parliamentary questions can be refused and how FOI requests can be refused. Lots of MPs now make FOI requests rather than parliamentary put down PQs because they can't do anything about a refused PQ, but they can go to Information Commissioner if their FOI request for the similar information is refused. So that's really shaken things up. I mean, the second thing is it's made disclosure more normal for public authorities. So, they're more reconciled to it. And it's set up Freedom of Information officers whose job is not to polish the reputation of the public authority, but to make sure the legislation is complied with. Now, some of them do a better job than others, but that does sets up a little arm, a little pro-disclosure unit in the better departments, at least. The Campaign for Freedom of Information had considered whether we would still be needed once the Act came into force. And we looked at some other countries where the Act had been under attack after it came into force, and we thought it's quite possible that might happen here, and we were very quickly proved right. And so I think it has been important that a body that follows FOI closely and is independent and can argue the case for protecting and improving the Act is there. Obviously, the very process of requiring public authorities to cut their spending and their staff affects the resources that go into answering freedom of information requests. And sometimes new legislation introduces new restrictions. So the government's now proposing a new system for investigating NHS accidents affecting patient safety. And they're setting up a new body whose work will be excluded from freedom of information. So the new the new body that is in charge of overseeing the investigation of safety problems in the NHS, information it receives about particular problems will be protected from disclosure. It will be an offence to disclose that information. There'll be a statutory bar on the disclosure of that information. So that's been justified as a way of reassuring people who speak to investigators that their identities will be protected, their ability to speak privately will be protected. But actually you don't need that in order to do that. Those people are protected already under the existing exemptions. And what their new system will do will mean that bits of information that don't need to be protected in order to encourage people to speak frankly will be protected as well. And it will increase secrecy if it isn't stopped before all that legislation goes through. So that is the problem that we're seeing all the time, which is there is pressure from bits of government that find FOI uncomfortable. And one of the things they're proposing to do, for example, was to remove the public interest test from those exemptions which allowed government and public authorities to protect their internal discussions. So you'd have a complete wall of silence about, even after a decision and that a policy had been announced, and you wanted to say, what's the factual basis for this? What were the arguments for this? Did you even look at this problem, this particular objection? If you did look at this objection, how did you address it? Which gives you the chance afterwards just to understand whether they did a serious job of trying to make this policy work properly, or whether they just did it because they committed to doing it and they really didn't care what the consequences were. So that's one of the great benefits of the Freedom of Information Act in the form we have it, is you can get at that material after, usually not before a decision's taken, but sometimes after the decision's been taken, and the more time passes, the more chance you have of getting some of that discussion material that goes on. Well, that was at risk of being taken away from us altogether. You know, luckily, the government couldn't demonstrate that it genuinely was being exposed to damaging levels of over-intrusive scrutiny, because it isn't. So the Act has been under pretty repeated attack ever since it came into force. But the last time there was a big attempt to restrict the Act, the Conservative government set up a committee to review whether the exemptions were protecting sensitive information properly. And they set up a committee of 5 people, one of whom was the former Labour Home Secretary Jack Straw, who had introduced the Freedom of Information Act, but since then had been its biggest critic. He basically said it's too much openness, doesn't protect the government decision-making process properly, doesn't charge people enough for information, doesn't make it easy enough for government to withhold information. And so there was a lot of suspicion that by putting Mr. Straw on the committee, the government was actually stacking the cards in favour of restrictions. As it happens, the press was universally hostile to that whole exercise. And the committee showed itself to be responsive to evidence about how the Act was actually being operated. And they came up and said, we haven't seen evidence that the exemptions are not protecting information that generally needs to be kept secret. And 3 or 4 months before it finished its report, the minister basically surrendered and said, we hope this committee is not going to recommend restrictions to the Freedom of Information Act. And the Cabinet Secretary more or less said he was very much in love with freedom of information, didn't want to see anything bad done to it. At which point I think everybody realised the Act was probably safe, but it had taken very, very vigorous campaign by the press. And no part of the press supported the government. So when the government proposed to repeal the Human Rights Act, parts of the press supported it on that, but no part of the press supported it on restricting freedom of information, which is a very, very positive thing. And you know, I think will make it harder for government to attempt to head-on assault on freedom of information in future, but there are all kinds of roundabout ways of doing it. With paper records, there's a great presumption against chucking stuff away. It's much, much easier to keep it than to get rid of it, and people tend to hoard it, which is a very good outcome for freedom of information. With electronic stuff, some systems automatically delete the record after a period of time. Government departments tend to have a rule saying, you know, you must delete your emails after 3 months, or they'll automatically be deleted after 3 months, unless you deliberately selected material for permanent preservation. So all that tends to wipe the record clean after a very short period of time. And actually Michael Gove, who was the Education Secretary at the time, who was trying to withhold his private email account messages about government business, was making that argument, and the Cabinet Office was making that argument, and Information Commissioner rejected it. And actually the Department for Education Freedom of Information team rejected it as well at the time, because they knew perfectly well that if you're doing government business on your own equipment or systems, it's still subject to FOI. But the difficulty is, in order to enforce your rights, sometimes you've got to hand your records over, either to the Freedom of Information Officer or to the Information Commissioner for the FOI officer or the Commissioner to check. And it's pretty difficult for an FOI officer to say to the Minister, I want you to hand over all your emails so I can go through them to make sure you haven't been doing it, or I want your passwords. You know, I mean, that puts the FOI officer in a very difficult position, and it's a difficult situation to enforce. But if government found freedom of information very easy to live with, there'd probably be something wrong with the Freedom of Information Act.